Hello there. On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, today's programme comes from the site of the concentration camp where more than 1 million people were killed by the Nazis. The King will join world leaders here to remember the 6 million Jews murdered during the Second World War and the millions of other victims of genocide.
My number was 84,303 and I can't forget it for the life of me. I tried so many times to forget it, but I can't.
The stories of the survivors still have the power to shock. We join the family of Ziggy Schipper as they retrace his journey to this bleak place. The first of a series of commemorative events gets underway at 8 o'clock this morning. Hello there, it's Monday the 27th of January and this morning breakfast comes from Auschwitz in Poland, 80 years after this notorious death camp was liberated. On what is now recognised as International Holocaust Memorial Day, King Charles will join political leaders and survivors here to remember the men, women and children who were murdered by the Nazis at this place and right across Europe. 6 million Jewish people were killed during the Holocaust and millions of others because they were Polish, Roma, disabled, gay or belonged to other ethnic groups. If you've never come here, and I hadn't until this anniversary, it is an utterly overwhelming experience. In one way, it all seems very familiar because you've seen these images so many times before in photographs, in films. And when you stand here, it is almost impossible to imagine what happened because even though visitors come, this is not a movie set. This is real. Just a short distance from where we're broadcasting this morning are the gas chambers where in this camp alone more than 1 million died in the most terrible of circumstances. First this morning, our Europe correspondent Jessica Parker has this report.
Through these gates and into what was the largest and deadliest of the Nazi concentration camps, Auschwitz. It was here that more than 1 million people were systematically murdered, a majority of them were Jewish. "80 years ago to this day, the camp was liberated by advancing Soviet troops. Here they discovered what the Nazis had tried to hide, images and evidence of unimaginable suffering. Those who hadn't been forced to evacuate on the brutal Nazi death marches were found starved and terrorised."
The anniversary of the camp's liberation has since become International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a moment to remember the 6 million murdered Jews, as well as other minorities persecuted by the Nazis. Today, world leaders and royalty, including Britain's King Charles III, will gather here for commemorations. So will survivors, returning to a place that looms large as an embodiment of Nazi crimes.
During the Holocaust, people from all over Nazi-controlled Europe were brought here, crammed into rooms like these, worked to death or sent to die in the camp's gas chambers, a prison and extermination centre, preserved so the crimes committed here are known, so the world does not forget.
Jessica Parker reporting there. Well, she is about a mile from where we are, at the centre of what will be this huge commemoration event. Jessica, do you want to just start by talking us through what we can expect to happen today?
Yeah, good morning, John. I'm just outside Auschwitz I, the site here. It's a sprawling area, of course, that the Nazis constructed over a number of years. And what's going to happen today is, first of all, this morning we're going to see the laying of wreaths in the first camp, the main camp, as it's been known, by the Polish president, President Duda, and survivors as well, at a place that's known as the Death Wall. And that is where the Nazis, SS guards, executed people, some of them Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, Jewish people as well. And then later on into the afternoon there's going to be the main ceremony, and that's going to be at the Birkenau site, about 3 kilometres from the first ceremony. And the Birkenau site is where the Nazis constructed their main apparatus for carrying out mass murder. And there what's going to happen, there's a huge tent that's been constructed over the gate to that site. And inside will gather politicians, France's President Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau from Canada, royalty, European royalty as well, including, as we've been hearing, King Charles. But it won't be a moment for politicians to speak. That will be the moment that we will be hearing from Auschwitz survivors, around 50 of them expected to come back here today.
And Jess, even at this time in the morning, there are hundreds of broadcast teams arriving at this vast site, which just shows the level of interest in what happens today all over the world.
Yeah, there is going to be, I think, a huge amount of interest today on the 80th anniversary of the camp's liberation. And principally, of course, what people will want to see and will want to hear are those stories from survivors. People who share their stories for a reason, because they want people to remember what happened here. They want people to learn lessons from the past as well. And also, of course, it is an act of remembrance. You were just giving the astounding figures before, John, as you were saying, 6 million Jewish people murdered during the Holocaust, other minorities persecuted as well, and at this site alone more than 1 million people were killed, the majority of them were Jewish. So a moment today for survivors, for world leaders, but of course for everybody to stand back, take a moment and remember the awful things that happened at this camp.
Jess, we will come back to you a little bit later in the programme. For now, thank you very much indeed. And just to give you a sense of where we are, that gateway that you saw at the beginning of Jessica's piece with Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. That's what it said, hugely ironically for those millions of people who were arriving here. Well, that gateway is just over here behind those buildings, and that again will be the focus of much of the televised coverage that you'll see as the day goes on.
80 years to the day since the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp. More than 1 million people, most of them Jews, died here, including many children. Around 50 survivors returned today for a ceremony honouring those who never made it out. Many dressed in blue and white in remembrance of the prison uniforms they were forced to wear, and they shared their memories. Good evening from Auschwitz in southern Poland, where commemorations have been held to mark 80 years since the liberation of this notorious concentration and extermination camp, established by the Nazis in the Second World War. An estimated 1.1 million people died here, making it the site of the largest mass execution of human beings ever recorded. 1 million of those killed were Jews. The other victims were largely Polish, Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war. Throughout the day, ceremonies have been taking place. Earlier, around 50 survivors of the camp returned here to lay wreaths and candles. And at the main ceremony, survivors recalled the horrific events that happened here. Leaders from all over the world, including the King, were in attendance. Commemorations have also been taking place elsewhere, including in London. We'll have more on that shortly. But first, our Europe editor, Katja Adler, begins our coverage with the events that took place here today, 80 years on from the liberation.
A moment of silence for all those who perished. Survivors with their families, alongside royals and other visiting dignitaries. All in this huge tent in the remains of Auschwitz death camp, specially designed here to remind everyone what it was like to arrive in crowded cattle trucks, like hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over Europe, then condemned to the gas chambers.
I represent the children. The very few of us are left. From my town, 4 children survived. We are also here to proclaim and to pledge that we will never, never, ever allow history to repeat itself.
80 years ago, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers fought side by side to liberate Auschwitz. Vladimir Putin wasn't invited here today, though, because of his invasion of President Zelensky's country. The Europe we live in now is fractured, full of friction.
I urge all people of goodwill, and especially I ask of the young people, be sensitive to all expressions of intolerance and resentment towards those who are different.
The survivors' message is strong, but because of their age now, many weren't able to make the journey here today. Like Yisrael Abshlez, who now lives in London.
That's me, prior to Auschwitz.
Of the 440,000 Hungarian Jews sent to Auschwitz, he was one of the very few who survived.
At the age of 14, my childhood has finished. And some of them say, your parents, can you see the smoke? That's where they are. They were all killed. They were sent to the gas chambers and their bodies were burned.
Auschwitz Museum is opening a new wing to mark today's commemoration in what was the family home of the extermination camp's commander. Höss was celebrated by the Nazis as the perfecter of mass extermination in gas chambers just over the other side of this wall. In the meantime, on this side, in perfectly tended gardens, he played hide and seek with his 5 beloved children. Underneath the family house is a tunnel into the death camps, linking Höss's 2 very separate lives. When we commemorate the Holocaust, it's important not to dismiss the perpetrators as evil, exotic monsters, nothing to do with us. Höss was a human being, a husband and a father. And the Holocaust didn't start with the gas chambers. It began in everyday homes, with everyday hate. The kind we're seeing increasingly on social media and in politics now.
Good morning.
That's why Holocaust survivor Marla Trebic spends so much time in schools.
What can happen when a civilization breaks down? And we've seen what Hitler did and what it resulted in.
She wants to warn them to be vigilant.
It's better to hear from a witness than just reading off a sheet of information.
There's always going to be a struggle in standing up for what's right, but if it's the right thing to do, then you should definitely go for it.
Did it make you think about discrimination today?
Yeah, there's still racism and there's still people that carry on these sort of beliefs today. It's horrific when you think about it.
Here in Auschwitz, Marla was carrying a great responsibility, the only representative of all UK Holocaust survivors at today's commemorations.
We are here to remember, but I remember them all the year round, every year, because I've experienced it, and it's very important for me to be here.
This year's commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz is seen as particularly significant. Possibly the last big anniversary, most of these eyewitnesses will be alive to remind us what we need to remember and warn us what we're already in danger of forgetting. Katja Adler, BBC News, Auschwitz.
Well, as you saw earlier in Katya's piece, King Charles is here attending today's ceremonies. He spent time speaking to a group of Auschwitz survivors in Krakow and told them the responsibility of remembrance rests on our shoulders, adding, we should never again be a bystander in the face of violence and hate. Our senior royal correspondent, Daniela Ralph, reports now on the King's role in today's commemorations.
He had wanted to be here in person, where so much brutality happened, to see this place with his own eyes. King Charles has become the first British monarch to visit Auschwitz. Earlier, the King had been in Krakow, meeting Holocaust survivors at a Jewish community centre he's supported over the years.
God save the King!
You are wonderful. And are you keeping reasonably well?
Yes, I try. I do my best to keep well.
as survivors shared their memories and their fears for the world.
It's absolutely important that all world remember that it happens and it could happen again.
There was a blessing for the king too, as he spoke about the importance of being in Poland today, calling it a sombre and sacred moment.
The act of remembering the evils of the past remains a vital task, and in so doing we inform our present and shape our future.
That collective duty to remember is a message the king has brought with him to Auschwitz. This is no ordinary royal engagement. Those close to the king say it is a deeply personal pilgrimage for him, something he has found poignant and profound. At the commemoration event, European royalty joined the king, listening and reflecting on the stories of courage and anguish. As the king laid his light to honour those who died, it was a public vow to the survivors that he would keep their stories alive. Daniela Ralph, BBC News, Auschwitz.
Most Auschwitz survivors are now in their 80s and 90s and could not make today's ceremony. One of those is Susan Pollock, who lost more than 50 relatives in the Holocaust and was herself sent to Auschwitz when she was just 13 years old. I went to meet Susan in North London, where she now lives, and she began by telling me about the day in 1944 when the Nazis arrived at her home in Hungary and told the family to prepare to leave.
They said, "We'll take you somewhere safe. Tomorrow morning we'll come for you." The police came for us. We were ready. I was a little girl. We were so obedient. We got into this train full of little children, chock-block full. We were on top of each other and we were fearful. We weren't people anymore. The fear absolutely absorbed us. And children were dying and left there.
And you saw that?
I saw that. Babies were dying. As we realized, are we going to survive?
And you had no idea where you were going. When you arrived at Auschwitz, what happened there?
When we finally arrived, there was a voice, still speaking Hungarian, approached us and says, and I remember it very clearly, "Don't say you're younger than 15 years old."
At Auschwitz, younger children were often taken straight to the gas chambers. And that's what kept you alive?
That's what kept me alive.
What about your mother? What happened to her?
I learned later she was sent to the gas chamber.
Straight away?
She was no use. That's the reason. No use for doing any work. She was an elderly woman, heartbroken.
And what was going through your mind, Susan? I mean, there you were a young child.
My mind wasn't functioning. We can't retaliate against such violence. I suppose we wouldn't have minded dying there and there. We were not human beings anymore. We were just worse than animals. Hope, all that disappeared.
What was daily life like for you in the weeks that you were at Auschwitz?
We had to stand in front of Dr. Mengele.
Dr. Mengele, who conducted the horrific experiments on adults and on children. You had to stand naked?
Naked. He had to see those who were losing weight rapidly. Gas chamber.
Looking back, what do you think about the people, the guards at Auschwitz, that kept you in such horrific conditions?
When freedom finally appeared, there was no revenge. We walked away and wondered, how do I make a living in this world?
Do you fear for the future?
Sadly, anti-Semitism is not disappeared. It's not gone. Do not forget. Do not forget. Very important.
The remarkable Susan Pollock talking there. Well, the Prince and Princess of Wales have joined Holocaust survivors and their families, along with senior politicians at a service in London to mark the liberation of Auschwitz. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust is encouraging people across the UK to take part in a national moment at 8 o'clock tonight by lighting candles and placing them in their windows. Landmarks will be illuminated in purple as a show of solidarity. Well, Rita Chakrabarti joins me from the Guildhall in London. So, Rita, tell me more about the ceremony that's going to be broadcast this evening.
Well, Fiona, there were around 70 Holocaust survivors at what was a highly moving event in which we heard harrowing testimony from people who'd survived the horrors of the Second World War. And the climax of the event was the lighting of candles. And this is an element of the ceremony that the Prince of Wales took part in. There were 80 candles, a candle for each year since the liberation of Auschwitz, and also a symbolic collective act of bringing light where there was darkness. The Prince and Princess of Wales also met survivors at an event after the ceremony. They were able to hear firsthand their accounts. And the Princess had met some of the survivors before, and it was clearly quite an emotional meeting for her. The theme of this year's ceremony was Never Forget, and that's particularly relevant given that many of the survivors are now in their 80s and 90s. So although this remains within living memory, it won't be so long until it passes into history, as it were. And there were also voices in the ceremony who were saying that in this age of misinformation and disinformation, it becomes vital to listen to those who had to endure these horrors during the Second World War at the hands of Nazi Germany, because their personal testimony is undeniable and has to be heard. So everybody is being encouraged to light a candle to place in their windows at 8 p.m. tonight.
Rita, thank you very much. Well, as you've been hearing, the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz, but the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was not invited to the ceremony here because of his country's invasion of Ukraine. Today he attended commemorations to mark the 81st anniversary of the lifting of the siege of Leningrad. Up to 1 million people died during the Nazi blockade of the city, now known, of course, as St. Petersburg. President Putin issued a statement today saying the Red Army's liberation of Auschwitz revealed to mankind the truth of the Nazis' crimes. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, has been looking at how the Holocaust is remembered in Russia.
This monument near St. Petersburg encapsulates, I think, how Russia today views the Holocaust. It's quite new. It was only unveiled last year, actually on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, although the focus here is not the Holocaust itself, even though more than 1 million Soviet Jews were murdered by the Nazis. It's called the Monument to Soviet Civilians who fell victim to the Nazi genocide. More and more I hear Russian officials using the phrase, the Nazi genocide of the Soviet people, shifting the focus away from the Holocaust to how the Soviet people as a whole suffered in the Second World War. And they did suffer. More than 27 million Soviet citizens were killed in what's known here as the Great Patriotic War. And this monument reminds us of the great suffering during the 900-day siege of Leningrad. But this refocusing feels like part of an effort by the authorities to present Russia and Russians as victims, not just in the past, but also in the present, even in the light of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and as Russia continues the war there. Because of the war in Ukraine, Russian officials weren't invited to the Auschwitz commemoration, even though it was the Red Army that liberated the camp, the 27th of January later becoming International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Well, our Europe editor, Katja Adler, is with me now. And Katja, this is possibly the last time that we will see survivors, certainly in these numbers, attending a ceremony like this. So more important than ever that we hear, that we listen to their testimony.
I mean, absolutely, Fiona, you've spoken to survivors, and so have I. And of course, you listen to their words, but you feel their pain, their experiences, and the message that they want to send to you. And that is why it's so important. We've heard the King say that. The Prime Minister was here in Auschwitz about 10 days ago. He talked also about the importance of talking to survivors. And in the lead up to today's commemoration, I've gone and spoken to school children in the UK and across Europe, in Germany and elsewhere. 15-year-olds who often, you know, they don't really want to know about politics or think about the world sometimes, but they sit with a survivor and it opens their minds and they say, you know, I believe it now. I believe about the history of the Holocaust. If I hear it in a history lesson, I might not believe it. And it's also making them think. Some of them, 18-year-olds I spoke to, they'll be first-time voters. And they were talking then about discrimination in society because Europe is under pressure at the moment, whether it's in politics, which is fractious, or on social media. And that's what we're hearing survivors say. It's no longer just, in inverted commas, the lesson of never again from the Holocaust, but a warning as well that they want to send, and very much of the future of generations. Be vigilant. And when they're no longer here to share that message, that is a concern and a challenge.
Katja, thank you. Clive, thank you. Well, today here at Auschwitz has been a day of great emotion, sombre reflection, and more than a few tears shed for the millions who died during the Holocaust, more than 1 million just here. We've heard from some of the 50 survivors, dwindling in number and increasingly frail, who made the journey here to tell their stories and to pay homage to those who were murdered. The voices of the survivors took centre stage so that the world should never forget what happened here. I'll leave you now with some of the memorable images of the day.
On an icy, windy day, I stood and watched helplessly as little girls from the nearby barrack were marched away crying and shivering to the gas chamber.